welcome to some more questions and answers here on the Old Front Line. These are questions submitted by you, the podcast listeners, and each month we select some of the best questions that have been submitted via email and the Discord server to answer here and hopefully give us all fresh perspectives and new knowledge of this vast subject of the Great War. So let's begin. It's been a busy start to Season 8 of the Old Front Line podcast, and the recent episode about the Albert-Bapaume Road on the Somme prompted quite a few questions and discussions about the culture of the Old Front Line, but also the point and question that I raised myself about the naming of the Tara-Usna line, the Tara and Usna hills that overlook the village of La Boisselle and those great valleys, Sausage and Mash Valley, and the battlefield from that early phase of the fighting on the Somme in July of 1916. And quite a few of you very kindly emailed in with your own thoughts on that and some background about those names and where those places may be in Ireland, for example. And what I might do in a subsequent Q&A, as I'm going to gather some of that information together, is kind of tack that on the end, just so we can kind of have a little bit of extra knowledge brought about through responses from you, and it's always good to hear from you. But let's get down to our questions for this episode of the question and answer feature of the Old Front Line podcast. And as always, you can send your questions in by two main methods, which is email and the Discord server, and there's links to that in the show notes. But as you'll see from this week, people have sent them in via some other means as well. And again, that's all there in the show notes for you to find. So let's get down to our first question, which comes from Stephen Duncan on email. He's just back from a visit to Ypres in Flanders. Stephen asks, Ypres was levelled in the Great War, so why did the British defend a three-sided salient and consume so much life? Surely, if they had simply let the front come up to one unified front, then those in the salient would have had less mileage to defend. I'm sure the brass hats had an explanation, but perhaps you could offer an answer. Well, it's a good question, Stephen. Many people who travel to Ypres and they see the staggering scale of loss on the memorials like the Menin Gate and Tyne Cot, and stand in Tyne Cot Cemetery and see that vast city of the dead, and then they travel the landscape and see British cemetery after British cemetery. They visit the massive German burial grounds at places like Langemarck and Menin and Vladislow, and see French graves and Belgian graves and American graves from 1918. They wonder what that sacrifice was for in such a tiny corner, a tiny pocket of Belgium. And in many ways, Ypres was of almost no strategic value. If you look at the fighting as it kind of evolved in 1914, to the north, the King of the Belgians, you may recall, had given the order to open the sluice gates and flood the Yser plain, which had effectively cut off a route for the German army to outflank the Allies in the north and go along that coastal plain and perhaps come round the back of places like Ypres. The flooding of that ground meant that that was impossible, and French and Belgian troops met the Germans in that Yser sector. British and French troops met them in the central area around the city of Ypres, and the British line then extended for about 20-odd miles on into northern France, and beyond that, of course, was the French army. So none of this was happening in isolation. There were other fights which kind of helped create this stabilisation when that war of movement came to an end. Both sides were in a bit of an impasse, staring at each other, digging in. The trench lines begin to be formed. And Ypres sat there. At that point in 1914, the British dominated the ground themselves. They held most of the high ground in the central part. The French held some too, and it was the Germans who were at the disadvantage. And at that point as well, by the end of 1914, by the end of what became known as the First Battle of Ypres for the British, 56,000 British soldiers had been killed or wounded or were missing there or prisoners of war, and already blood had been spilt. And I think that when you come to the importance of territory, there is a strategic value, there is a tactical value, there is a value to the people who have lived and grown up there, And post-war, of course, these places took on a symbolic value with the sacrifice. And that sacrifice is important because even for the men at the time, once you and your comrades have shed blood in that soil, suddenly it takes on a different meaning. And if we look at the wider aspect of this, yes, if the generals had sat down in 1914 and looked at the situation in Flanders, they had the French Flanders hills behind them, and they could have withdrawn from Ypres, pulled back to those hills, and more cleverly and perhaps successfully defended that against the Germans. Perhaps that would have been the better strategic decision to have made at that time. But remember, what did Britain go to war for? Britain went to war for gallant little Belgium. It had safeguarded Belgian neutrality, and the Schlieffen Plan and the German invasion of Belgium is what had pulled Great Britain into the conflict. And all that remained of gallant little Belgium was that tiny pocket of ground in West Flanders. That was it. And if we'd have given up Ypres, we'd have given that up too. And Belgium would have been under the heel of the Imperial German Army boot. And Great Britain, and perhaps its population, stirred up by this, and the sacrifice of their troops. Far more men fell at Ypres in 1914 than at Mons or Loretto on the Aisne and the Marne. This was already a place of British sacrifice. Could we really have just walked away from that? So for no strategic value, we defended ground in Flanders that really had no value from a military point of view. It had already much more of a symbolic value. And there was no way to outflank it. The Western Front, you remember, was continuous. You couldn't go round it once it was formed. 450 miles of trenches. And the two ends, the Belgian coast and the sea, and the Swiss mountains on the border of the Vosges region of eastern France, that was it. They were the only way round, both of which were effectively impassable. And both sides, all those armies, were deadlocked along that front for most of the 4 years of the Great War. So it became what you could describe as Britain and later the Empire's anvil of sacrifice on the Western Front. Ypres and what it stood for, the wider country of Belgium, was the very reason Britain had gone to war, and perhaps it must be defended at almost any cost. And that's exactly what unfolded over those 4 years of the Great War. It consumed every regiment of the British Army, all of the corps of the British Army, every corner of the British Empire went to Ypres, and by the end of it, 250,000 of those men, and some women as well, had died there during those 4 years of fighting. And the memorials to the missing account for half of them, so the ground itself is not just saturated in the blood of the fallen, it contains the fallen themselves, which today, more than a century later, archaeologists like Simon Verdigam are still uncovering. So if ever there was in the Great War sacrificial ground for Britain, Flanders, Ypres, the Salient as it became known, is very much part of that. So there is no real military answer to your question, Stephen, because Ypres was of little military value. But it's what it stood for, what it represented, and more than a century later, I think, still represents in terms of the meaning of sacrifice. So I hope that's answered your question. Question 2 comes from Andreas F. on our Discord server. And it's not difficult to use the Discord server. It's kind of like a chat room, really. And you can follow the link in the show notes, and it takes you to it, and you can leave a comment or a question there. So Andreas asks, I have a question regarding the French cemetery on the Loretto Heights. When being there in August, I wondered what qualified a soldier to be commemorated inside the church. So what Andreas is talking about here is Notre Dame de Lorette in northern France. It's the hill of Lorette, the Loretto Heights, where the fighting was in May of 1915, and on the very crest of it is France's largest military cemetery from either World War, with more than 40,000 burials. It's an amazing place to visit, with row upon row of crosses and a huge plot of Muslim graves of French colonial soldiers who fought there in 1914 and 1915. During the centenary, they built the Ring of Remembrance that commemorates every soldier of all nationalities who died in northern France during the First World War. That's just outside the main cemetery itself. And then two other features within it are the chapel or the church or the basilique, and also the tower. And the tower is a phare in French, a lighthouse, because there's a huge light at the top of it. And underneath that tower is a crypt with the bodies of over 6,000 French unknown soldiers from the Great War, with others from the Second World War that were added subsequently, and some more recent conflicts like the Algerian War and the war in Indochina as well. But principally, of course, this is a Great War site. And within the burials, there is every rank from ordinary private soldier right through to a French general, General Barbeau, who was killed leading his Alpine division up the slopes of the hill here in May of 1915. And then there is the chapel, the church, the basilique. It's a very imposing building, and within it, on the walls, is plaque after plaque after plaque recording individual soldiers. So this is what Andreas is asking about. What was the qualification for a soldier to be recorded on one of those plaques within that chapel, within that church? Well, simply, it was public subscription. It was money. If you could afford it, you could have your son, your husband, your brother, your father's name added to that wall, because the French made a decision after the Great War not to create memorials to the missing. No Tynecots, no Chapval, no Meningate. Every French soldier, irrespective of the circumstances of his death and burial, would be commemorated on war memorials in their home towns and villages and cities. And on the battlefields, if they had a marked grave, they would be buried there, although the families could request the body be brought back to be buried in a local cemetery in the family grave. But on the battlefield, there was no memorials to the missing. And you can imagine, just like if this had happened with British and Empire soldiers, there would have been a desire for those families of missing soldiers to have something. So through public subscription in chapels like this, it was decided that they would cover the walls, help fund the construction of these sites by opening them up to public subscription, and if you paid, you can have your relative's name placed on a plaque. So what we're looking at when we see these memorials inside this chapel are almost all of them, in fact probably every single one of them, is a soldier who was missing, men who do not have a known grave. And some of them are simple memorials that just commemorate a name, a soldier's unit, and perhaps a date and place of death. Others have a little bit more information. And you see this type of memorial and this type of chapel on pretty much all of the main French battlefields of the Great War. If you get a chance to go to Verdun and visit the ossuary at Douaumont, that is exactly the same structure. It's a huge memorial, but within it on the walls are similar plaques commemorating the missing and the dead of the Battle of Verdun. So that's exactly what this is. The basilique is not just a space where you can worship and you can remember and you can honour the sacrifice of the dead, and there were many memorial services there in the interwar period. What we see with the cemetery as we know it today dates from the 1920s, and that work on this site was finished by the 1930s. The fair, the lighthouse, was one of a number that was planned to be placed on all of the key French battlefields of the Great War to send beams of light across those battlefields, calling out to the souls of the dead. That project was never properly completed, although there are a couple of other lighthouses in other battlefield locations, this being the largest of them all. And it is a hugely impressive site. It's something we often talk about how World War I meets World War II. When the German army rocked up there after the fall of France in June of 1940, they went up there, and I don't think they could really believe the size of this cemetery, because it features in a lot of German soldiers' private photographs of this period. But when we go there today, it's just as impressive. If you look at drone views of it, if you stand there yourself, if you go up the tower and look down, which you can do, it's staggering to see the scale of French sacrifice. And when you stand there and you look at it, I think that's when you get a bit of an insight into just how important the French contribution was to the Great War, and really how this war on the Western Front was, for most of the 4 years, a French war. It's the best way to describe it. A French war. A war involving, on most of the front, French soldiers fighting the Germans, with Britain at the very beginning occupying tens of miles of ground, and even its peak only occupying just over 100 miles of the Western Front, and the French occupying hundreds of miles of the Western Front for most of the war. And of course, when we look at these graves, when we look at the names in the chapel that are on these plaques that commemorate the missing and the dead, and we go into the ossuary of the tower and see those thousands of soldiers' remains that are there, this is only a fraction of France's 1.4 million dead from the Great War. Dead, it was said that if they marched in ranks of 4 underneath the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, it would take 80 days and 80 nights. So the Loretto Heights, Notre Dame de Lorette, an amazing part of the Great War battlefields. For many people to get down to Verdun, the Chemin des Dames, it's a long way down the front, perhaps not within everybody's ability to do that. But if you want to go to a French battlefield of the Great War and understand France's contribution, go to Notre Dame de Lorette and visit that wider ground. And it's well overdue for us to have a podcast looking at that, and that will come down the line, hopefully, later on in Season 8. So thanks for that great question, Andreas. It highlights so much more than just what is on those plaques. Our third question comes from a listener on fan mail. Now, there is a link in the show notes to fan mail, and it kind of sends me a text message through Buzzsprout, the company that hosts the podcast. When you do that, it doesn't tell me who you are. So if you send a little message into that, and it's great and it's fine to do that, put your name on there, because otherwise I won't know who you are. And I don't know who our friend is who has sent this in, but he tells us, "Hi, from an addicted Australian listener who really enjoys listening while in the tractor working on a Queensland pineapple farm. The question I have is, quite often you mention about how unusually cold the winter weather was during the years of the Great War, and I've wondered if anyone has investigated if the temperature and weather patterns were inadvertently influenced by the amount of chemicals and heavy metals which were exposed to the environment via the artillery and or small arms." Well, this is a really interesting question, and I don't have an answer to that latter bit. I'm not an expert on chemistry or the physics of the use of huge amounts of munitions that can then change weather patterns, although this is something that we do see referenced in warfare, particularly modern warfare, where modern armies have tried to change the weather to help influence battle. Because when we look at the subject of the Great War, we often look at the landscape, and part of the landscape is the geography and the geology, what's underneath, but it's also what's above. The weather is a really important factor, and I often encourage you, travellers to the battlefields, to go to the Western Front, to go to that landscape of the Great War, not just in the summer, when the days are long and the weather is generally okay, but go there in other seasons too. See it when it's soaking wet, and the Somme fields are thick with mud, and the Flanders ditches are full of water, and the dust, if you go there in the summer, the dusty expanse of the Champagne battlefields, and the white mud just sticks to your clothing, gets in your mouth, gets in your ears. There's so much to get out of it, and if you go there in the depth of winter, you can feel how cold it is and the effect of snow on the modern landscape and how that makes you feel as a visitor, protected by Gore-Tex and decent boots, which of course soldiers in the Great War did not have. So what kind of insight do we have to the weather? Now, it is recorded in quite a lot of contemporary documents, and you'd have to really search to kind of get an accurate weather forecast of a particular area. Artillery units are particularly good at recording the weather because atmospheric conditions did affect their ability to accurately fire shells at the enemy. So if you look at a siege battery diary or a field artillery battery diary, you see a lot about weather and temperatures and pressure and all this kind of stuff recorded in those diaries. If you go up a few scales to headquarters diaries, divisional headquarters, for example, even corps headquarters, you will see the weather report sometimes in those for particular sectors on the front. And I'm always amazed that no one has ever written a book on this, gone through these records, pulled this information out, and given us a really good kind of picture of what the weather on, for example, the British and Empire sector of the Western Front was like in great detail during those 4 years of the Great War. So if you've got a few years to spare and you fancy quite a big project, then getting to grips with weather on the Western Front through those records could be something that would be certainly of interest to me and a much wider audience besides. Now, we can't do that in the context of answering this question, but what we can do is look at kind of a wider data set of weather in that part of France. And some time ago, somebody on Twitter very kindly put me in the direction of some records that were kept and are now on the NOAA website, which is an American website, the National Center for Environmental Information. And you can go on there and you can select date parameters and then location, and it will come up with the weather, recorded weather for those areas. So when you pull out France, it has not every town in France, because not every town in France necessarily recorded weather data then. It's got principal towns, of which, of course, unsurprisingly, Paris is the top of the list and is the one that is nearest to the British and Empire Commonwealth sector of the Western Front. So let's focus in on a particular period of the war that we know was especially cold, because we read this in the memoirs of the men who were there. We can read it in war diaries, and I remember discussing it with Great War veterans when I was interviewing them in the 1980s and 90s. And that winter in particular was the winter of 1916-17, which in many books on the Great War you will see noted as the coldest winter of the war. Now, I have seen temperatures recorded in many accounts, and some of them have suggested that the temperature on the Somme dropped to -20, perhaps even -25. So when we look at these records that are part of this NOAA website, for Paris in 1916, we have those 4 key months of the winter from December to January to February to March. So that's December 1916 through to March of 1917. In December, the temperature recorded in Paris was -4. In January, it was -10. February, -14. And by March, it was -6. Now, all of that's cold, but not -20 and certainly not -25. So is that supposed temperature that we've read about in so many books accurate? Well, when I lived in France, what I noticed through just looking at the weather forecast on French television or reading it in the French newspaper was the regional difference. The Somme is chalk downland. Beyond the Somme towards Paris, there are hills. And just like the landscape of Sussex, where I grew up, and Kent, where I've lived for a big chunk of my life on and off, and even when I lived up in Yorkshire, it was the same. Landscape can influence weather. On the east coast of Britain, in Yorkshire and East Yorkshire, that could be especially cold, while on the other side of the Pennines, they might be not so cold, but could have had snow. So there was a big regional kind of difference there, and it's the same down in Sussex. Crawley, where I grew up, might be cold, but the real snow was on the high ground of the South Downs around Lewes, for example. And all of you listening will have your own examples of this. So it's no different in northern France. So when we look at temperatures that in Paris in January and February 1917, during that winter of 16-17, were -10 and -14, that is not the kind of temperatures that were recorded in so many books, but it could have been a lot colder on the Somme. We just don't have the recorded French records that are now part of this American website to be able to back that up. And certainly when I was living there in the mid-1990s, the first winter I spent there was a particularly cold winter that seemed to go on forever, on and on and on. And at its peak, it was something like -20. Everything froze up, everything was frozen, and it was very difficult, even in a 1920s house, which then didn't have central heating. We had log burners and coal fires. It was still difficult to live and survive and go outside. It was very cold. The village was cut off. And there's no war going on around us at the same time, so we can only but imagine what it must have been like. But what I think those temperatures do, those are recorded temperatures for Paris, they give us a bit of an insight into what it might have been like on the Somme front. So definitely 1916 is a cold winter, going from -4 in December to, at its worst, -14 in February. If we jump on a year to 1917, so this is the winter of 1917-18, when the front has now moved forward, British soldiers are on the Hindenburg line facing Cambrai, and they're around Arras and near to Saint-Quentin down in the southern part of the British front. That is also a cold winter, and in December 1917 it was -11 in Paris, and in January it was -14. So it's on a kind of par with the previous winter. And perhaps for some of the men who were there, when we look at these memoirs and we read these accounts, perhaps the two winters somehow, understandably, became a little bit confused. What is clear is that even if the Somme was just these temperatures, and I say in inverted commas, just these temperatures, -10, -11, -14, for men, and they were a tough generation, the generation of the Great War, but for ordinary men to live in what is basically ditches in open fields in those kind of temperatures, no wonder so many of them became sick. And units that were in the frontline area during that period suffered more casualties from the elements than from the enemy. This is totally understandable. And in particular for the British and Empire Commonwealth troops during that winter of 1916-17, the cold conditions that were a mix of very cold weather, heavy snowfall, slight increase in temperature that would melt the snow and fill the trenches full of water, led to an epidemic, really, of trench foot, where soldiers' feet rotted inside their boots, often with its worst examples leading to amputation of the feet, if not the entire leg. So that was a massive problem during that period. And I think that weather and the importance of weather in our understanding of the landscape of the Great War and our understanding of the battles that were fought on that landscape is all part of the study of the Great War. But I wish I had more information for you, our Pineapple Farm listener who listens in his tractor down in Australia. I wish I had more to be able to point to how the chemicals from the explosion of the weapons and then the chemicals that were thrown up into the kind of atmosphere, if you like, how that then affected the actual weather patterns themselves. And if anyone can point to any research on that in any kind of way, then again, get in touch with the podcast, and I'd love to hear from you, and we'll do a follow-up to that on the Q&As. I think that this is for me, one of the great benefits of these Q&As, because you send in such excellent, intelligent questions like this that help us understand in a wider way the whole aspect of the Great War, from battle and conflict and casualties and sacrifice through to subjects like this. So please keep these kind of questions and all the questions coming. So thanks for that. I hope you're doing all right down there in Australia, and a big thumbs up for next time you're in your tractor cab working hard on your farm. Our fourth and final question comes from Elizabeth Hill on email, and she asks, I was wondering, other than nursing, did women play any other role during the First World War on the Western Front? Well, first of all, in terms of the British Army, then if we look at the experience of women in the Great War, then nurses obviously represented the largest number who got to the Western Front, who served close to the battlefields and suffered as a consequence of it, because there were casualties amongst the nurses. Although they were not in the forward trenches, they were in casualty clearing stations that was typically 6 to 8 miles from the battlefield area. They could still be shelled, they could still be bombed by Gotha bombers, and even right back on the base at Étaples or Abbeville or many other camps that were right away from the battle area, those were bombed from the air, and women died there too. And of course, sickness, influenza, that swept Europe in 1918-19 claimed a lot of victims, female victims of the Great War, as well as their male counterparts. serving in military units. So nursing is one element of that, and we've mentioned a little bit about nursing in the Great War, and I'm not going to repeat that because that's not what this question is about. So in terms of the British Army, no women fought, with one exception that we know of, and that was Sapper Dorothy Lawrence. Dorothy Lawrence was 20 years old and had crossed to France to try and join the VAD, the Voluntary Aid Detachment, and she'd been rejected. She had a status as a journalist, but had been arrested by the French as a potential spy at one point. And somehow she managed to get hold of a military uniform, get up to the battle area, and get into and join a tunnelling company of the Royal Engineers and work with them on the Somme front in the lead up to the Battle of the Somme. These were conditions that, even for the toughest individual, were very, very challenging, and she could not cope with them and became ill as a consequence of it. And this revealed the fact that she was not a sapper, she was not a man doing her bit in the Royal Engineers, that she was a woman there essentially under false pretences. And rather than kind of pat her on the back and reward her for her patriotism and sterling duty, they arrested her, and she ended up in a lunatic asylum for a while. As a consequence of this, she wrote a heavily censored memoir, which achieved some notoriety because of its unique content, but sadly she was institutionalized and remained isolated and pretty much alone until her death in the 1960s. And I think without that book, we probably wouldn't even know that she had existed. So could there be other Dorothy Lawrences out there? So that's a very, very extreme example. For the British Army's point of view, the most important contribution of women on the Western Front outside of nursing was in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, which was formed in January 1917 to employ women as labour troops behind the front line, but importantly, not in civilian clothing, but in uniform, and even more importantly, they were being sent overseas. That formation became the Queen Mary's Army Auxiliary Corps, or the QMAC, in April of 1918, and by war's ending, 57,000 women had served in both of these formations, and of those, 17,000 had served overseas. Now, I can't stress enough how important that is. The figures, the size of this, thousands of young women who served outside of the borders of Great Britain in an active theatre of war, in military uniform, with military status and rank, and were subsequently awarded campaign medals for their service. This is a massive turning point in the history of the British Army, and an important beacon to women's contribution to the First World War. But they didn't fight. They were there to act as labour troops. But yet, as we know, by 1918, how Britain and its empire in the Western Front won the war on the battlefield was through infrastructure and supply. And the QMACs were very much at the heart of that. And as soldiers, as service personnel, service women on that battlefield, on that landscape of the Western Front, some died. There were women, again, in camps that got bombs, that served in these units, that were killed. Some were decorated for gallantry. There were a number of military medals given to women of the Queen Mary's Army Auxiliary Corps for an air raid at Abbeville, for example. So their role is a really important one, a massive turning point and a massive contribution. And the first time in the 20th century that women would play an active role in a total war. A generation later, that role would be even bigger. On the home front, women were employed obviously in munitions, massively important part of the war effort, and there was also the Women's Land Army. So these are the types of units that young women, and in some cases older women, joined and served and took part in the Great War. There were other nations on the battlefields of the First World War that actually sent women into combat. There was an Englishwoman, Flora Sands, who served with the Serbian army in the Great War, and there's a famous book about her experiences called A Lovely Sergeant. And some years ago, I came across a contemporary of her, a member of a Serbian unit called Milunka Savic, who was almost certainly the most decorated woman who served in combat during the Great War. And she served with the Serbian army fighting against the Austro-Hungarian forces and was decorated multiple times by multiple nations. And rather than tell her full story here, because I do intend again to return to the subject of women in the Great War for a separate episode, I've put a video from the Great War YouTube channel onto the podcast website so you can watch a little bit more about her story. But this subject of women, not just in the British and Empire, Commonwealth forces, but women in the Great War, is something that we will return to, because there are some truly incredible stories from nursing to labour to combat on the battlefields. So thanks so much for that excellent question, Elizabeth Hill, and we will return to this in due course. So that's it for this week. I hope you found the questions and the answers of interest. As always, keep them coming in, send them in by the traditional methods, all of which I'll link to in the show notes, and I'll see you again soon for some more questions on the Old Front Line. You've been listening to an episode of the Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.